On summer evenings, I used to run home through this network of streets. It was a cut through from Victoria to West London. I've always felt something here, something in the way the tall brick buildings loom and block the light. It has an atmosphere that's older and darker than the surrounding streets. So I decided to look into it, and what I found was extraordinary. This is the story of the Devil's Acre, Westminster's dark secret.
It all started with a marsh. This entire area, the Abbey, Parliament, the Palace, was built on a river island. The River Tyburn, rising on the Hampstead Hills, divided as it reached the Thames and formed a low flat waterlog 8 in the tidal river. The Anglo-Saxons called it Thorn Aya, the island of thorns. An 8th century charter described it simply as a terrible place. The Tyburn still flows beneath these streets, absorbed into the Victorian sewers, but still moving, still finding the Thames. The island went underground. It never went away. In the 10th century, Benedictine monks arrived on the island and built a monastery. They called it the Westminster, the Western Church. Edward the Confessor rebuilt it in the 1040s, consecrating it days before his death in 1066. Harold Godwinson was crowned here that January. William the Conqueror, who took the throne from him that same year, was also crowned here. Every English and British monarch since has been crowned here, except 2 kings who were never crowned. The Abbey owned the land for miles around. It owned the marsh, it owned the streets, and it owned something else that would define this ground for the next 800 years: the sanctuary. By the 16th century, the streets just west of the Abbey were prosperous. Elizabethan gentlemen built villas along leafy lanes, with gardens running down to streams. Tothill Street, the oldest street in Westminster, was lined with mansions. Lord Dacre of the South lived here, Lord Grey de Wilton opposite. The streets were said to be inhabited by the flower of the gentry. The street, now known as Old Pye Street, is named after Sir Robert Pye, MP for Westminster, who had his garden wall here in the reign of Charles I. The street, now called Stratton Ground, takes its name from Stourton, the Dacre family's townhouse. These were streets built for men of standing, but the ground beneath them never forgot what it was: marshy, subsiding, prone to damp and decay. As London grew and the gentry moved west, the houses subdivided, gardens disappeared, streets built for one family became streets housing 100. By 1720, a man named Strype was describing Pye Street as better built than inhabited. By 1800, this ground, this island of thorns, these streets named after lords and parliamentarians, had become something that would shock the empire and make a criminal slang word part of everyday English. It had become the Devil's Acre. There's a street near Westminster Abbey called the Sanctuary. Walk it today, and it takes about 30 seconds. Most people pass through without a glance. But the name's not decorative. The surviving street marks the approach to the medieval sanctuary, the area where the Abbey offered legal protection from arrest to criminals, debtors, and outcasts. The people the rest of the city wanted removed gravitated here, on land the Abbey owned, under the Abbey's protection. Thieving Lane, as it was known, ran beside the Abbey sanctuary and through the district that would later feed into the Acre. In this way, the Abbey created the conditions for the slum it would later refuse to fix.
It might be hard to tell, but William Caxton set up England's first printing press here. This was once the Abbey's almonry, the charitable building that fed the poor.
In 1861, the journalist John Hollingshead walked from Tothill Street into what remained of that almonry, the building where the Caxton's press had stood, and described what he found. A low passage leads out of Tothill Street into the hollow shell of a house, whose rooms seem to have sunk into a few heaps of rotten bricks. Dead dogs, soaking fragments of old placards, and other refuse lie amongst the bricks and dust. England's first printing press stood here. By 1861, it was rubble and dead dogs. That is the Devil's Acre in a single image. The Abbey owned the land the slum stood on. Throughout the entire history of the Devil's Acre, the Dean and Chapter collected rents from the buildings crowded into the waterlogged ground. They were the landlords. And in 1850, a cardinal said publicly what no one else in the establishment had been willing to say. Cardinal Wiseman, announcing the creation of the Catholic hierarchy in England, chose Westminster as his title, and he explained why. Close under the Abbey of Westminster, there lie concealed labyrinths of lanes and courts, and alleys and slums, nests of ignorance, vice, depravity, and crime, as well as squalor, wretchedness, and disease, whose atmosphere is typhus, whose ventilation is cholera, haunts of filth, which no sewage committee can reach, dark corners which no lighting board can brighten. But that's not the most important sentence Wiseman wrote. The sentence that follows is the one that matters. If the wealth of the Abbey be stagnant and not diffusive, if it in no way rescue the neighbouring population from the depths in which it has sunk, let there be no jealousy of anyone who is ready to make the latter his care. He is telling the Abbey directly, you built your wealth here, you watch these people suffer, I will do what you would not. The passage helped introduce the word slum into mainstream English. Coined in 1850 to describe the failure of the most powerful religious institution in England to care for the people at its gates.
This is Old Pye Street, the spine of the Devil's Acre. In 1861, a journalist called John Hollingshead walked this street. He wrote that no policeman dared come here alone at night. The male inhabitants lounged outside their doors, always dressed, always ready to move. By 1876, there were 18 houses here and 495 inhabitants.
Hollingshead described Old Pye Street as the most openly acknowledged high street of thieves and prostitutes, a street that had no mock modesty about it, no desire to conceal its real character. Threepenny lodging houses on both sides, many of them below street level, entered by steps down into the earth. Nothing for the barefoot children to stand on, but the black, damp, uneven ground. These were the subdivided remnants of Elizabethan villas, their gardens built over, their rooms let by the night, their foundations slowly sinking back into the Tyburn marsh beneath. A cleric named Frederick Farrer worked among the poor of Westminster and left one account that stands apart from all the statistics and surveys. He was called to the bedside of a dying young woman in Pye Street, the last stages of consumption. Her husband had forced her into prostitution to fund his own living. Farrer recorded her final words, "I have worked very hard, and I am very tired."
This is Perkins Rents, a short alley that connects Old Pye Street to Great Peter Street. On this corner stood a pub called the One Tun. Charles Dickens knew this area well. He'd been a parliamentary reporter just round the corner. And with the One Tun school of pickpocketing, a real-life Fagin enterprise, it's not hard to imagine that this might have provided some inspiration for Oliver Twist.
The One Tun on Perkins Rents was what the London City Mission reports called the School of Phobology. Street orphans were brought here and taught the art of pickpocketing by a Fagin-like master. The pub's transformation is one of the more extraordinary stories in the Acre. The philanthropist, Adeline Cooper, held a meeting in the pub's Skittles alley, raised money, and converted the school into a ragged school. By 1871, it had 133 pupils. The One Tun mission continued on Old Pye Street until 1930. The building is gone. The street is still there. On St. Anne's Lane, Hollingshead turned into a side court called St. Anne's Place. It had, in his words, every feature of a sewer. A long puddle of sewage in the hollow centre, passages like old sooty chimneys, inhabitants buried in the gloom. As he turned to leave, rough, long-haired heads peered around the entrance, then vanished, like figures in a Punch and Judy show. The court is gone, the lane survives, but with nothing left to show what was once at the end of it. Just 5 minutes walk north from Old Pye Street, and the world changes entirely. Cockpit steps, a curved flight of late 17th century stone steps, descending from Old Queen Street to Birdcage Walk. Grade 2 listed, the last physical remnant of the royal cockpit, where the aristocracy came to watch cocks fight and bet their fortunes. It's the same city in the same decade, 5 minutes apart.
On the one hand, you have the children of Perkins Rents being taught to pickpocket. On the other, the aristocracy at the royal cockpit, descending these stairs to bet their fortunes on blood sport.
Westminster held both worlds simultaneously, and pretended that neither could see the other. By the 1870s, the Devil's Acre had survived Victoria Street's attempt to clear it, and cholera was still a present threat. James Greenwood, writing in 1874, called it a West End cholera stronghold. He walked in during an epidemic and found people taking their prescribed rum neat. Rum was widely recommended by doctors at the time as an anti-choleric, to be mixed with pure water. In the Acre, there was no pure water to mix it with. Then Greenwood found a voice he couldn't have invented, a resident of Peter Street, speaking directly in anger. "We're nothing but a large muck bed, what they grows their mushrooms on. That's what we are. If they had to live here amongst us, with their kids and their missuses, it would be very soon altered. Look at the West End, they ain't had no cholera. Ask Belgravy and Great Victoria Street. That's what's the reason on it." He knew about Belgravia, he knew about the proximity to power. He understood the political economy of his own exclusion with complete clarity. What he didn't know was that the solution being prepared for him, the clearance, the new streets, the model dwellings, would not house him either.
In 1872, the French illustrator Gustave Doré sketched the Devil's Acre. We can tell from the angle of the sketch that he may have drawn the scene from the Albert's upper balconies, before modern Victoria Street filled in around it. In fact, this building is the sole survivor from the first phase of Victoria Street.
Rochester Buildings, on the corner of Old Pye Street and Perkins Rents, was built in 1862 by the merchant William Gibbs, one of the earliest acts of slum clearance in the Acre. Its Baroque pediments appear clearly in the Doré woodcut. They still stand today. The Doré image shows the old hovels in sunlight and the new housing in shadow. Whether this was observation or editorial comment, it's a precise visual record of the moment the Acre was being replaced, and what was replacing it. Victoria Street opened in 1851. It was designed by James Pennethorne to cut directly through the Devil's Acre, in an act of what its proponents called sanitary and moral engineering. The idea was that a wide, well-drained road would destroy the courts and alleys that sheltered crime and disease. If this sounds familiar, it should. Exactly the same method had been used at St. Giles, where New Oxford Street was driven through the Rookery a few years earlier, with the same intentions and the same consequences. These roads didn't remove poverty, they moved it. What actually happened was that the Bishop of London told the House of Lords that Victoria Street had displaced 5,000 people. 3/4 of them moved into already overcrowded areas south of the Thames. The remaining quarter crowded into what was left of the Acre, which became denser still. John Hollingshead saw it in 1861. The landlords of the slums were raising their rents, and the poor were being packed into smaller compass. The street built to drain the marsh had raised land values. Higher values meant higher rents. Higher rents meant the poorest people couldn't afford to stay, and couldn't afford to go anywhere better. The same pattern that Abbey had established centuries earlier. A powerful institution controlling the ground, a solution that served the institution, the people at the bottom moving on, or moving in tighter.
This is where it was, built on a marsh, named after lords, then left a ruin for 200 years. A journalist walked past St Anne's Lane in 1861 and found a side passage that had every feature of a sewer. Passages like sooty chimneys, people buried in the gloom, all half a mile from Parliament. Old Pye Street still runs where it did. Perkins Rents, the sanctuary, and the lane is still there with nothing to show that what was at the end of it. And at the edge of it all, the Grafton Arms. This was here when John Hollingshead walked these streets. It was watching then, and it's watching now. The Devil's Acre's gone, but the urban fossils remain, if you know where to look. So, thank you for joining me on this investigation, and as always, I'll see you again at the next marker.